But first, we have a more important topic. That free speech is in peril across the West. Maybe not here where I am in the United States, but certainly back home. And some of the people fighting for free speech are the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF. And I have my good friend Paul Coleman on to talk about this very issue. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, there's a lot of work coming out of your outlet about how important free speech is, but I mean, in 2025, why is that even a question?
Well, it shouldn't be because a lot of the countries across the Western world that have enshrined free speech in their constitutions over the last several decades, as well as the international legal framework that defends freedom of speech, these things have been in place for a long time. But what we've seen in the last few years is that Western countries have increasingly undercut these free speech protections. They've passed more and more laws censoring speech. And now we're seeing cases emerge out of that where Christians and many others find themselves facing either censorship online or even arrest and imprisonment for peacefully expressing their views.
Every week on this show, I have either someone from ADF or someone from Christian Concern coming on to talk about someone in the UK who has been censored, usually a Christian who has been persecuted by the Christian state. It's absolutely absurd. It shouldn't happen. I shouldn't have a show. I shouldn't need to have a show to expose this lunacy, but we do. But it's deeper than these individual cases, isn't it? So last week, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom made a statement about the horrible, disgusting murder in Southport of these young girls. And he seemed to me to be dog whistling, and I hate that term because it's what the left often use about us when it's untrue. But it seemed to me that he was throwing in nuggets of trying to shift the conversation to online. He said things like, "Oh, the killer is a new form of terrorism, and he's clearly been browsing harmful content online. We need a way to stop people seeing all this harmful content online." He kept saying things like that, which raised my alarm bells because I thought, this is a man who clearly wants to censor the internet. I mean, am I far wrong?
No, it's the pattern that we have seen consistently over the last several years. Essentially, something happens, and those who are in power use it as an excuse to point out why we need more censorship. It's like that old phrase, if you're a hammer, then every problem is a nail. And so if you're a government censor, then the answer, the solution to everything is more censorship. And now the UK has such a vast array of censorial laws already in existence. The idea that we can solve the problems facing the UK and other Western nations if we could only just censor more speech is absurd. But we see this playbook happen all the time. We see legislation passed that's already vaguely worded, and then something happens, and then the immediate answer is, well, we need more robust legislation. We need more expansive legislation to counter this new threat, whatever it may be. And so it's not really a surprise that this has happened, but it is deeply concerning because they're talking about expanding the definition of terrorism, and the terrorist laws that we have in the UK are so far-reaching and expansive. If they start claiming, as the Prime Minister Keir Starmer did, that young men in their bedrooms are the new terrorists, then this could have a huge impact on half the nation. And they also want to expand potentially definitions of what it means online harm, misinformation, hate speech, and so forth.
I worry about this a lot because it seems that they want a way to silence people who are not in favor of the approved narrative. But I'm trying to get to the motives here because we've got an article on screen right now from the BBC. Rachel Reeves urges online platforms to remove violent content. So again, they're following through with the same messaging that they want to control the narrative. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the motivation here is that there's a belief from these people on the extreme left that if they control what we see, control what we read, they'll be able to control what we think. And they think that they are superior. Their ideology is superior to everyone else's, whatever ours. I'm sure you and I align on certain things, but I'm sure we disagree on certain things. But for them, they want us to align with them entirely. And the way that they think they can get us to do that is by limiting what we can see and therefore what we can think. Am I being naive or is this what they're...
But That's absolutely what's happening. And of course, if you look throughout history, that is the actions of dictatorships, not democracy. It's one of the core pillars of dictatorships is that if we can control speech, control the narrative, then we can ultimately control how people behave, how they think. And we see these so-called democracies across the Western world now just essentially repeating the same actions of these dictatorships that we saw throughout the 20th century. And that's not an exaggeration to say that, in my opinion. It's the same philosophy. And of course, the other thing here is that the UK government, as well as other Western nations, have such an array of laws already in existence. So the idea that if they could just censor more speech, they would solve the problems is naive, it's ridiculous. And we have not seen evidence at all that more censorship ultimately leads to better outcomes.
So it's ill-informed, it's not evidence-informed, and but they're pushing on with this. Of course, there's one platform we do have free speech now, thankfully, but we didn't for the longest time. You know, the narrative around COVID, for example, was very restricted across Facebook, across Twitter, and the social media is the online marketplace of ideas. It is essentially where we have conversations now and where the news comes from. But we have one platform now that is in support of free speech, relatively speaking, and that's X, of course. And so, what does the European Union want to do? What does the Great Britain want to do? They want to limit X. And so, do you think they're going to be legislating against the last remaining free speech platform?
Well, I think what we saw with Brazil in the late summer of last year, 2024, was essentially an attempt to do just that, where if people remember, in Brazil, X refused to censor certain political speech, pro-life speech, and other speech, and then the entire platform was shut down as a result. And many people spoke in the EU context in favor of those actions and threatened something similar to X in the European market. Essentially, if you don't censor speech, then we will shut you down. And so they've passed this Digital Services Act, which is a huge piece of legislation, extremely complex, but essentially it threatens these platforms with crippling fines if they don't censor speech, and could ultimately try and shut down and block these platforms themselves. What we're seeing now, however, I think that's the future that we were walking into. But with the recent changes in the political landscape in the US, what we now see is essentially a great divide unfolding in the West. The US has spoken very strongly in the last month about protecting freedom of speech. And these other nations, EU nations, the UK, and so forth, are
Hmm.
seeking to double down on censorship. And this is going to lead to some, I think, strong political tensions in the coming weeks and months. And really, two sides are emerging here, and we're not sure what's going to happen.
That is interesting because obviously I'm living in the United States now, but this is a very recent thing, and I'm loving the idea that we have free speech here. It's enshrined in their law, in their constitution. It's what they believe in more than anything over here. It's wonderful. Compared to our homeland, the United Kingdom, of course, this show used to be on mainstream media, which was under the regulation of Ofcom. And that meant that I had to be very careful in everything that I said. Every monologue was scrutinized. The legal teams were all over it. The liberal producers were pressuring me to not speak about issues like abortion, for example, which I think are very important. It was difficult. It was a hard time. But now, of course, Ofcom has been granted regulatory powers over the internet as well. They haven't implemented this yet, but they have been granted these powers. What do you think that means for the state of the United Kingdom?
Well, I think that we will see their attempt to regulate online speech in the same way they've sought to regulate other channels. However, the challenge will come in that these platforms, a lot of them are US companies and US based companies, and US officials have already said, if you come after our companies, then there will be trouble, essentially, paraphrasing. But for example, JD Vance said last year, if X is blocked in the European Union, then the US will consider withdrawing NATO funding. So, significant thing to say. And so it's one thing for Ofcom to attempt to police things within British jurisdiction, British television, and so forth. But in the digital age, it doesn't really work like that. We're talking about global platforms that could be founded in one place, led from another place, and the speech goes all over the world. And what these censors are seeking to do is not just censor in their little backyard. That's impossible anyway. They're seeking to censor speech for the entire world, and it's going to lead to some battles ahead.
That is interesting in that because there's been a change of administration in the US, there's now a bit of strength in this. I don't think the previous administration would have handled this in the same way. In fact, I think they probably would have colluded with the
Well,
UK.
they were in total cahoots. So I mean, it was such a collaboration between all of the Western nations, the big tech companies. Essentially, Elon Musk broke that monopoly when he bought X. And now Trump has essentially broke the governmental monopoly over this as well. And I think you could see in Mark Zuckerberg's statement about 10 days ago, when he then saw which way the wind was blowing, said he did not want to be an arbiter of truth, that their fact checking had gone too far, it was too political. But at the end of Zuckerberg's statement, shouldn't get as much attention as the rest of it. He essentially called on the US government's support to help now defend the rights of Meta around the world. So he's sort of flagging here that he can see a battle's going to come in the European market and elsewhere, and requires the strength of the US government to protect Meta's right, essentially to operate an open platform.
Absolutely. And so I suppose we as Britons are reliant on the United States in their strength at the moment to support and encourage free speech and also to protect it, even for us. How do we fight back in our political democratic system? How do we ensure our representatives have our best interests at heart?
I think that the British people have been duped into agreeing to a lot of censorship over the past few years, and we have to recognize where all this is going. It is the British people should not accept that Southport happened because there was too much free speech online. That is patently absurd. And the British people should not be duped into believing that. And I think we have to look at the vast, as I say, array of censorial laws that the UK has already adopted on our watch over the past decade or so. And ultimately, it cannot, as Britons, we cannot be satisfied with the idea that we'll be saved by US tech platforms with Trump's backing. We, as British citizens, have to defend our right to freedom of speech in the UK. And when we see these statements by Labour ministers and others looking to further curtail this right, we have to stand up and push back. We cannot rely on President Trump or others to do it for us.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. Paul Coleman from ADF, God bless you and God bless your mission. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching my Common Sense Crusade. If you'd like to watch the whole show, you can subscribe to lotuseaters.com for as little as £5 per month, and then you get access to a bank of content as well. My show is 3 p.m. every Thursday. See you there. Deus Vult.